How's everyone doing today? Good. All right. So we're going to move right along. We're going to talk about music and speech perception today, and then we'll be done with the auditory processing section of the course. And we'll move on to the other senses as well after that. All right. Um, so uh, we're going to be talking about music perception first, and then we will transition somewhere near the latter portion of class to processing speech, and then we'll talk about speech all next time as well. So music is an obvious way to express thoughts and emotions. It's something that we've known for a really long time. Um, we know that the oldest known instruments that we've found are over 30,000 years old, right? And so these are like flutes carved from animal bones and stuff like that and everything. Um, e- Even if you look throughout history, right? Mathematicians and things like that, like Pythagoras, was obsessed with both music and math because these things have connections to each other, right? Um, we also know sort of the counter portion of this that music can affect a mood and emotions, right? And so there's this whole field in clinical psychology where they look at things like music therapy and everything, and how that actually affects people's mood and all. And they have shown that certain types of music and everything can actually do things like reduce pain, reduce anxiety, for people suffering from like painful cancer treatments and stuff like that and everything. Um, so music tends to extend across a range of frequencies from about 25 to 4,500 hertz. And we can hear higher frequencies than that, but we lose the ability to pull out some bits of musical tones and stuff like that and everything at these higher frequencies. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Um, Music is at least in part determined by the pitch, right? And so this is the basically how we are perceiving frequency in the music. Okay, so if you look at various different instruments, they exist over various. They are able to produce various different frequency ranges of sounds. Right? So the harp has a really large range, whereas something like the saxophone here, the bass saxophone has a much shorter range, right? Same thing with like the piccolo, right? The piccolo is isolated to these very higher frequencies, whereas the bass saxophone is isolated to these lower frequencies down here. If you were to look at the frequency ranges by the uh, the sound level, right? So the decibel level, um, you can see that uh, everything below the red line we can actually hear, right? Um, and so there's this sort of relationship where once we get up to about 4,500 hertz, sort of you lose the ability to distinguish information about these higher frequency sounds in terms of their musical qualities. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Um, so music is broken down into various different octaves, right? And so an octave has basically a 2-to-1 ratio between their frequencies, right? So if you look at something like middle C, so C4, the fourth octave here, its fundamental frequency is at 261.6 hertz, right? If you go one octave lower to C3, that's at 130.8 hertz, right? But if you go one octave higher, right? So this is half as much, right? If you go one octave higher, you double that C4 frequency range up to 523.2 hertz, and that gives you are literally just doubling the frequency for that given note. Okay. Um, Now, what's a little bit weird is that if you look at it, most people see, hear C3 as similar to C4, okay? Uh, because they are the same note, although E3, right, if you look at it, has a much closer frequency range to C3, right? Yet they will perceive C3 and C4 as being more similar, okay? And so what this tells you is that pitch in music is more than just frequency alone, right? It means that there's other qualities that have to be factoring in here in order for people to perceive the pitch of the music, okay? It can't just be the frequency ranges, right? So you can often visualize these different these different chords and everything as these different octaves rather as as spiraling in a musical helix. Okay, so if you look at this, right, this is an A1 note, a B1 note, C2, D2, so on and so forth, right? And it's spiraling around here. Now, as you go up this helix, the frequency is increasing. Okay. Um, if you look at this, right, this is A1, this is the first octave, A2, second octave, A3, third octave, right? And so the tone height, as it's going up, if you're going up in an octave, or if you were just going up this way, right, the frequency is increasing as the tone height goes up, okay? The tone chroma is telling you basically the note, right? So like all of your A's are this reddish orangish color here, right? And so that tells you essentially the grouping across the various octaves here. And so each note has its own chroma, its own color, right? But you can see how frequency increases as you start to spiral its way up. Okay. So most musical notes tend to be below about 4,000-ish hertz, right? So like right about here, right about at that audible threshold for people actually being able to hear that, right? Now we can hear sounds up in this range, right? Remember, it wasn't a smooth cutoff, right? It was a sort of weird shaped, partly oval shaped figure from the last lecture, right? And so this doesn't just go away. You can hear things, but you can't go ahead and actually pull out the relationship between the tones, right? So you have trouble perceiving the relative difference between tones at these much higher frequencies, right? Which is why most of the musical frequencies are in below that range. Okay. So when people are creating music, they will often put the notes together into chords, right? And so these are when three or more notes are played, three or more notes with different pitches are played at the same time. Okay. Now each one of these chords, right? So you could see like G5, G4, and G3 all being played at the same time. That would be one chord, right? Each one of these chords could be what's known as consonant, where they have basically a simple ratio of the given frequencies, and it tends to sound pleasant. It tends to go together, right? It tends to sound like something that is pleasant on the ears, right? This sort of subjective nebulous term here, right? But the chords can also be what's known as dissonant, right? Where they sort of clash and don't seem to go together very well, right? Now, in terms of music perception, there are actually a lot of cultural differences from one culture to the next, right? So there are certain things like like perceiving the different octaves that seems to be fairly universal, but the notes that are contained within that octave tend to vary from culture to culture. So if you look at Western cultures versus Javanese cultures, so that's like Southeast Asian, like Indonesian type area, I think. They tend to perceive fewer notes within an octave. Okay, and so what that means is that each note actually takes up a wider range of frequencies. Okay, so there's essentially more slop in what they would call one frequency versus another, right? That it covers a wider range of frequencies in that case, right? So rather than A going just up to this frequency range, it might extend out further for them. Okay. So when you actually test musicians in these various cultures, they use their the various head and estimate the intervals between between the various musical notes and everything. Okay, so their learned notes are influencing how they are perceiving the music. Okay, this is something that is in fact actually learned, right? Because if you look at 6-month-old infants, they can detect inappropriate notes, right? In both in across all of these ranges of frequencies here, right? So they can detect um, sort of the dissonant sounds and things like that and everything in both Javanese and Western types of music. Okay, so babies can tell these things apart, right? But when but as they learn their particular musical patterns from their culture, they lose the ability to go ahead and hear the sounds as they are, and in fact are actually fitting them into the categories that they have learned over time. And this will actually be a common theme. When we get to speech production later on, you'll see that babies basically start out as being able to hear all of the sounds, right? And then as they learn the language, they actually lose the ability to perceive sounds that aren't used in their language. And this is why it gets much harder for older kids to start learning a new language, right? Because they literally cannot hear the sounds that they need in order to go ahead and interpret what's happening in that language. We'll talk more about that later on. So there's a phenomenon known as absolute pitch or perfect pitch. And so typically when we perceive a note, right, we are only able to tell what that note is, most people, when it is played relative to other notes. So we are making essentially relative judgments. Is this higher, lower frequency? Is this one octave versus another, so on and so forth, right? Relative judgments between two notes. You can go ahead and compare them and determine what that means. People with absolute or perfect pitch can hear a single note in isolation and tell you what note that was. Okay, so when you look at this, right, musicians tend to strive for absolute or perfect pitch, and there is some evidence that it can be learned to some degree, but a fairly substantial ongoing debate how much learning actually influences things. We know that if you start learning music very early on in life and you continue for a really long time, you are more likely to develop perfect pitch, but there's also a clear genetic predisposition. So people who speak tonal languages, things like Vietnamese and Mandarin Chinese, and also have extensive music training are more likely, disproportionately more likely to develop perfect pitch than other people. So There's definitely seems to be some genetic influence, just like everything that we talk about in psychology. There's nature and nurture here, right? There's genetic influences, and there's also environmental effects that stack on top of each other. If you are interested, these are a couple of different videos here. One that talks about the underlying psychology and neuroscience of perfect pitch, and then actually teaching and learning perfect pitch as well, if you're interested. Sort of the flip side to perfect pitch is a disorder known as amusia. Okay, and so this is where there's basically an impaired ability to detect frequency changes, right? So rather than being able to pick out that frequency, that pitch really, really well from a sound in isolation, you actually lose the ability to go ahead and determine what this is, okay? And this is known as tone deafness, yeah. They can, in very severe cases, this is my understanding. That my understanding, they can, that there can be recognition issues as well. Yeah. I don't know if amusia is less prevalent in Chinese and Vietnamese. I'm not sure. That's a good question though. So people who have amusia, on average, tend to have thicker than normal auditory cortex. So this is like, that's how their brain developed, right? They also tend to have fewer connections between the auditory cortex and the frontal cortex. Now, recall, right, when you are processing the information in terms of the identity of a given speech sound, right, what that speech sound is, the information more frontally to start to be processed in these more frontal regions to identify the actual what speech sound you're hearing, right? Because there are fewer connections going from auditory cortex to frontal cortex, they are effectively less efficient at identifying those speech sounds, right? So they are essentially spending more effort doing that initial pre-processing information in primary auditory cortex, and they're not sending enough of that on to the frontal regions to identify the actual identity of the sounds that they're hearing. So music can also contains melodies, right? And so this is like the sequence of notes or chords, and how they sort of string together to create this coherent sound, right? So like if you think Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, right, it has that certain melody where it sort of is the timing and duration between the notes are consistent, and it creates a sort of rhythmic pattern that you hear. And it is not necessarily a specific set of notes, right? You can actually go ahead and move things up an octave or up a key and still produce the same melody, right? It is in fact the duration and timing of the various notes, so the tempo, right, of the sound, right? How quickly the notes are coming, how long each note lasts, produces the melody, right? And so it is not necessarily dependent upon the octave or the specific note that's being played, okay? So if you look at any sort of sheet music, and I, full disclosure, have no musical ability, they, notes can last different durations, right? So you can go ahead and sort of transition from one note to another. Some notes will last longer than others, and that is what's used to actually produce the melody, right? And so even when you are increasing or decreasing the pitch, right, the melody will change based on those durations between those changes. Okay. Music also contains these rhythmic changes, right? Like we were just talking about with melody, but rhythm is part of a whole host of different things. Okay, so walking back and forth like I'm doing now, or waving my hand, right? Swimming, tapping your finger, tapping your foot. We develop rhythms when we are doing these things, right? We have a certain pace and you have a certain cadence when you are doing these things. Even speaking, right? You have a certain rhythm to your speech sounds. Weird thing is that we will often hear rhythms even when they do not exist. Okay, so we will go ahead and impose a rhythm on something that is even a constant set of sounds. Okay, so the sort of classic experiment of this was over 100 years ago. Bolton went ahead and had a whole bunch of identical sounds just occurring in sequence, right? And so they were perfectly spaced in time, so there was no rhythm to them, but yet people went ahead and they heard certain sounds as being accented, certain sounds as being unaccented. And so what an accented sound is when it is basically stressed, right? So you're emphasizing that particular sound. You could have a stronger attack phase, right? We talked about how the attack phase is when it onsets. So you could have that being more abrupt, essentially, right? And so people would impose this accenting of sounds in a very particular way, right? So sort of the classic example of this is when you are riding in a car, right? And you go onto the highway and the concrete has those grooves in it, right? And you hear thump, thump, thump. Rather than it being a consistent thump, 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 you'll hear typically some of them as being more emphasized than others, right? It'll be thump, 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 right? And that sort of rhythmic pattern is something that we are in fact imposing on a fairly constant signal. Yes. The constructive and destructive waves. Okay. Yes. So my understanding of this uh, is that this is something that we are doing in our head. This is not something that is inherent to the physical stimulus itself, right? So the fact that we accent one of the thumps when we're it is happening internally, not in the actual physical stimulus around us. We do lots of weird things to the actual physical stimuli that are coming in, right? We talked briefly about sort of how we categorize visual perceptual information. We collapse over a lot of the variability and everything. We're going to talk more about that in just either at the end of today or next class or something like that. But like we lose a lot of information in order to make sense out of our world, right? We toss out a ton of variance in the actual stimuli that we're getting, and that has certain consequences in terms of how we actually perceive the world. Like our brain is constantly trying to categorize everything that we see. I don't remember if I showed you guys people talking about when they were like in a sensory deprivation tank, or the Ganzfeld effect, where they're basically deprived of sensation and their brain will just make stuff up, right? trying to make sense out of no input, right? So like when people go into a sensory deprivation tank, it is relatively common for people to start to hallucinate. Because you're not getting any sensory input, right? Our brains are designed to classify and categorize sensory information constantly. And in the absence of that, our brain will come to some conclusion, even if it's not right. In dreaming, I mean, dreaming is an internal representation that we are generating. There's actually been some fMRI work where they went ahead and they showed people movies. I don't remember if we talked about this or not. They showed people movies in the MRI. They recorded the neural activity. They used machine learning to say, like, when this stimulus is on the screen and they're seeing this, this is what that neural pattern looks like. And then they let the person fall asleep and they waited until they were dreaming and they were recording. Then they would wake them up and ask them what they were dreaming about, like which scene in the movie, because they just saw the movie, right? Which scene they were dreaming about, if they happened to be dreaming about the movie. And their machine learning algorithm can reliably actually reproduce what they reported with a moderate degree of accuracy based on the recorded neural activity, right? So it's an internal representation when you're dreaming, right? It's something that you're creating based on your previous experiences and everything. You're actually activating visual areas and things like that in the same way that you do when you have mental imagery that you're using. That was my tangent. Any other questions, thoughts? Okay. Yeah, I think I got the point across here. All right. So there's also a phenomenon known as syncopatia, where basically it's when there's a regular deviation in the rhythm, right? So you'll have a particular rhythm and then it will sort of shift, right? And this can happen in a phenomenon known as syncopated auditory polyrhythms, right? Where you have two different rhythms that are playing together, right? And because they are slightly out of sync from one another, one of them will generally become the dominant rhythm that you hear. And when that happens, the other rhythm will essentially get shifted. You will shift it to meet the other rhythm. Okay, so you're essentially adjusting this rhythm so that you can go ahead and put these things together into one understandable rhythm. So we actually develop the ability to perceive melodies pretty early on in life, right? So on average, 8-month-olds can recognize new melodies after hearing them for just 3 minutes, right? So you take a 8-month-old baby into the lab and you play it some new melody versus an old melody after just 3 minutes of exposure at that point, based on like preferential looking and stuff like that. So it will turn towards the novel sound typically, because babies tend to seek out novelty. If you look at 7-month-olds, right? Babies that were the 7-month-old babies that had their parents play Mozart sonnets at home every day for 2 weeks were able to recognize the differences between those sonnets, right? And that's at 7 months old, right? So it requires a little bit more exposure when they're a little bit younger, but it's developing pretty early on, right? Before they're even a year old. So we're going to move on to speech at this point. So humans are capable of producing lots of different speech sounds. There's at least 5,000 different languages in the world as of right now. And across all of these various different languages, there are about 850 different speech sounds, right? So some of them will be common across various different languages, and then others of them will be unique to different languages, okay? So the vocal tract is basically the airway that's right above the larynx, and we use that for a lot of speech production, right? And so that includes the oral and nasal tract. And then we use the flexibility of the vocal tract in order to go ahead and help us shape our speech sounds. So this is sort of the anatomy that we use here, right? You've got your lungs down here that are important for respiration, right? So they're taking in air and they'll expand when you take in more air. And then you will force the air out. It will pass up through up through the larynx and through the vocal folds, which is at the top of the larynx right there. It will then, the air will then pass up into the nasal tract, up into the nose area, or up into the oral tract through the mouth area, right? In order to be shaped by things like the tongue and the soft palate of the mouth and things like that and everything, right? Or shaped by parts of the nasal tract and everything as well, right? Speech production, and that also includes things like phonation, right, which occurs in the vocal cords or vocal folds, right, so this area right here. And then there's also articulation, where you're shaping those speech sounds, the air as it's passing through the oral and nasal tracts as well. So respiration and phonation occur throughout sort of the speech production process, right? So as you start to initiate speech, the diaphragm, right, that muscle that's right below the lungs, right, it stretches down when you take a deep breath in, and then it pushes up when you go ahead and you exhale really hard, right? And that's to help compress and expand the lungs, right? So the diaphragm will go ahead and push up in order to go ahead and push air out through the trachea and up to the larynx. And then the air will then pass through the vocal folds that will make them vibrate in a very specific manner, right? So they can change shape as the air is passing by, in order to go ahead and change the phonation that's actually being produced, okay? And so at the larynx, there's actually two different vocal folds. So if you look back at this picture right here, there's vocal folds here, and then there's ones that are actually underneath there as well, in order to change the shape at multiple different points. And that changes essentially the pitch that you're getting from the sound, right? So children have rather small vocal folds, and so you end up with a higher pitch, right? Bigger bodies, larger mass. So adult men, right, tend to have larger vocal folds, and so they tend to produce lower pitch sounds when they speak, right? So articulation is sort of how you are changing that speech sound after it passes through the vocal folds, right? So this is in the vocal tract, and again, the oral or nasal tracts, right? And so you're using lips, the tongue, right? The soft palate to go ahead and change how that air is passing through your mouth in order to change the sounds that are being produced, okay? And so all of those sort of shape changes to your to your oral and nasal tracts, that's what articulation is, right? When you're articulating a sound, you are changing the shapes of those structures in order to change the sound that is produced. The vocal tracts themselves will tend to resonate, right? So they will essentially vibrate at a specific frequency, right? And that resonance essentially can amplify certain frequency ranges relative to others. Okay. If you're interested in resonance, this is just another interesting video about using resonance of your voice paired with a wine glass, right, to go ahead and shatter a wine glass, right? So because when you hit a resonant frequency, it is basically adding at the peak of a given motion. So like if you would think about a swing, right, and you are pushing someone on the swing, right, if you push them when they are at their lowest point, right, you're going to actually have a much harder time because you have to stop them and then push them forwards, right? If you wait until they hit the peak at which the swing is the highest and then you push them, you are creating a resonant frequency, right, where you're pushing them when they are at their highest, and it requires much less effort. And with a rather small force, these things will build over time to create a much larger effect, right? So resonance results in larger amplitude building over time because it is occurring at a specific phase of the frequency. Does that make sense? Roughly? No? Sort of? All right. If there's questions, let me know. All right. So after the speech sound passes through the vocal tract, right, it has a certain resonance that's built into it. And so that resonance will produce a certain harmonic spectrum, right? We talked about harmonic spectrums last week. And bottom here, right? The speech sound will also typically produce certain peaks in these resonant frequencies, right? And these are known as formants, right? So you've got the first formant, the second formant, and the third formant here, right? And you can see sort of the filtered version of these formants up in section B here, right? And this is basically showing you how much energy or loudness there is at each given frequency, right? And that tends to correspond to the length of the vocal tract as you are producing a given speech sound. Okay. So for shorter vocal tracts, the formants tend to be higher frequencies, and then relative to longer vocal tracts, right? So the longer vocal tracts tend to produce lower frequencies. All right. Speech production is actually really quite complex. All right. This is what's known as a spectrogram. So you've got, if you were to go ahead and look at a constant sound, right, you would have some frequencies that are present in that sound, and then particular amplitudes for each one of those frequencies, if it's a constant sound. Now, in order to create a spectrogram, which is how we represent speech sounds typically, you would take these axes and you would flip them, right? So you'd have frequency on the y-axis here, right? So higher frequencies up here, and then lower frequencies down here, and then this is the actual loudness of those. Now, if you were to go ahead and sort of flip this, right, so that these lines are now coming out of the page, right? you could think of the height of these as being represented by different intensities of color, right? The higher the amplitude, the redder it might be, okay? And so what you can then do is, so each one of these would be one of these charts in B, right? So if you were to go ahead and look up, like for one very small time interval here, that would be one of these in B. And then as you move over, right, that chart would change to represent different frequency by amplitude spectra. And then it would just be plotted for that point in time, right? So this is how that frequency by amplitude spectra is changing in time, right? And the amplitude is illustrated by that red color here, right? So this is a louder portion at this given frequency. If you look at this given sentence, right, we were away. If you look at this, all right, we've got the word we, all right, maybe then it drops down. Maybe there's a break right there. Maybe you could see the word we there. But then you look at this, right, were away. There's no break between were and the start of the word away, right? When you look at the spectra, these things are all mishmashed together, okay? These things, right? If you even look at the word go over here, there's a big drop in the intensity in the middle of the word, right? And yet we perceive these as a break here between go and a break here for right? And a break here for year, right? There isn't clear breaks in the actual underlying signal, right? If you look at the signal based on frequency and amplitude over time, which is how we are assessing the signal, there's no clear differences here, okay? And we'll talk in a little bit about how we go ahead and actually parse this up into clear words. Do you have a question? Correct. Correct. A large part of it is learned. But there are lots of individual characteristics about the individual words and how you're mixing them together that will vary from language to language that you would have to learn in order to be able to determine where these breaks actually exist. Yeah, if you're hearing a language that you don't know, it is near impossible to go ahead and pull apart where the breaks are, like where the different word boundaries are. Me either. Yep. Yeah. Full disclosure, I had enough trouble with languages where I ended up doing American Sign Language for my secondary language because it's visual, right? It's completely separate. You can determine what a word is because it's a specific visual pattern, right? It is an entirely different way of learning a language. I feel like for some reason that was easier for me personally than learning another language where I have to actually determine these different word boundaries and things like that and everything that I couldn't physically hear, you know? So yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I mean, this goes along with the whole critical period, right, of language learning, right? The part of the reason why it is hard to go ahead and learn another language later on is because you've lost that ability. You're correct. Yeah, you co-articulate. You end up sort of mismashing these sounds together. Yeah. Okay. So if you look at things like vowel sounds in English, right? They tend to have you tend to be able to identify the sound based on a small number of formants. Okay, so if you have the first formant down here, right? And so this is based on the tongue position, right? So whether or not the tongue is high or low in the mouth, or and that's the low frequency, high frequency, right? And then you've also got when the tongue is in the front of the mouth or in the back of the mouth, right? And then again, low and high frequency. Those things are when the tongue is higher and low in the mouth, it is shaping the frequency that is being produced, right? When the tongue is high, is back or towards the front, it's also shaping the frequency, right? So these things are interacting with each other in order to produce the given frequency. And so these things can be looked at as the first and second formant that you're using in order to go ahead and in terms of the tongue position and everything, in order to go ahead and produce these speech sounds, right? So if you look at book, right, when you actually make the speech sound of book, the tongue tends to be higher and further back in the mouth, right? But if you look at the word bed, right, the tongue tends to be lower and more towards the front of the mouth when you're actually producing these speech sounds. In most cases, right, when we're classifying these speech sounds, we do that based on the articulation, right? So where the lips are placed, where the tongue is placed, where all of those things that are important for articulation are placed as you are passing that air through your mouth and nose area, right? And the articulation can be obstructed where you're blocking certain parts of the airflow, either totally or partially or slightly. And so you are essentially blocking how much air is coming out in order to alter that sound. It's also affected by the voicing, right? So whether vibrating or not at that given moment in time, right? So whether or not they have that resonance frequency in order to go ahead and amplify those given sounds. There are some sounds that are common across languages, right? And then there are other sounds such as like the English TH and the English R sound that are fairly uncommon, right? Where most languages don't actually use those. If you are completely obstructing the airflow, right, that is something where like if the lips are producing a b, p, or m sound, right, you are sort of at one moment in time sort of blocking that airflow, right? You can also go ahead and look at how some of these other sounds affect the various parts of like the soft palate and things like that and everything. Articulation can also be partially obstructed, totally obstructed, or only slightly obstructed. It can also go ahead and change over time, right? So you can sort of obstruct the airflow and then let it pass, or you can go ahead and have it go in the other direction. You can also go ahead and block it from passing through the mouth and instead have it go through the nose. And those will all change the sounds that you're producing in order to go ahead and articulate the given sounds that you're trying to make. Those vocal cords, again, can either be vibrating or not vibrating. All right, so at this point, we're about halfway through the slides. So why don't we go ahead and stop for the day, and then we'll pick up here next class.